Some storms don't just erase the road, they erase the line between living and dying. That day, Megan stepped out of her stuck truck in a whiteout, thinking she only needed one bar of signal to call for help. Then she heard it, thin, trembling cries under the snow, and found 4 bobcat kittens fading fast in her hands. She pulled them under her coat and walked into wind sharp as a blade until she reached a lonely cabin and knocked. An elderly man cracked the door, eyes hard with caution, and whispered, "If you ever hear 3 knocks out here, don't open." Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The first thing Megan Hart noticed wasn't the snow. It was the silence underneath it. How the world could be loud 1 minute with tires on gravel and wind in the pines, and then suddenly go muffled, as if someone had pressed a thick wool blanket over the whole mountain. Her truck's headlights cut a pale tunnel through the darkening afternoon, the beams catching flakes that looked like tiny shards of glass. The dashboard clock glowed a soft green. The heater pushed out air that smelled faintly of dust and warm plastic, and for a second it felt almost normal, like any other winter drive. Megan kept both hands steady on the wheel, the kind of steady you learn after years of fieldwork when you've stood under sagging lines, walked icy right-of-ways, and logged every warning sign before something becomes a disaster. She was a utility field inspector, one of those jobs most people only think about when the lights go out. A rural substation had reported intermittent power loss after last night's freeze, and the supervisor's message had been short. Check the access road, confirm the damage, document it for insurance and emergency repair approval. Megan knew the routine. Photos, notes, a call to dispatch. If it was bad, crews would be mobilized. Overtime, hazard pay, maybe even a temporary generator contract. Those words, emergency repair, insurance, generator, were the kinds of high-cost phrases that lived in budgets and paperwork, but out here they translated into something simpler. Warmth or cold, light or dark. The map on her phone showed a thin line curling into the backcountry of Idaho, the kind of place where the bars on your signal could disappear faster than a deer crossing the road. She didn't like being alone in places like this, but she'd learned to hide that truth under competence. She had a thermos of coffee that tasted slightly burnt, a heavy coat on the passenger seat, a reflective vest, and a small first aid kit she hoped she'd never use. She had told herself that the forecast said light snow. She had believed it. Then the wind shifted. It came as a hard sideways shove that rocked the truck and made the steering wheel vibrate in her hands. Snow didn't fall anymore. It flew fast and flat, stinging the windshield like handfuls of sand. The road ahead began to dissolve, the edges disappearing first, then the middle, until the world was nothing but moving white. Megan slowed, squinting until her eyes watered. Oh, bees. The wipers squealed across the glass, leaving brief streaks of clarity that vanished a heartbeat later. The pine trees that had been dark green pillars became ghost shapes, and then even the ghosts were gone. Her GPS chirped, recalculating. The little arrow spun once, then twice, like it had lost its sense of direction. The phone screen dimmed and brightened, as if uncertain it deserved to keep trying. "Come on," Megan muttered, not angry, just pleading in that quiet way adults do when they don't want to admit they're scared. She tried to ease the truck forward, but the tires hit a patch of soft drift. The engine's hum deepened, then strained. The truck lurched, sank, and stopped with a sickening finality, like a boot stuck in wet cement. She pressed the gas gently. The tires whined and threw snow, the sound sharp and useless. She stopped, breathing through her nose, tasting the metallic edge of adrenaline. Her fingers felt too warm inside her gloves, and that warmth made her suddenly aware of how cold everything would get if the engine died. She could wait. But waiting in a whiteout was its own kind of gamble. If visibility dropped more, nobody would find her until morning. If the wind buried the truck, it would disappear like it had never existed. Megan glanced at the rearview mirror. All she saw was swirling white. No tracks, no road, just blank. She opened the glove compartment and pulled out a small notebook. The habit of documentation so ingrained, it almost calmed her. Write down the time, location, conditions. She could already picture the forms: incident report, hazard assessment, claim documentation. The words were tidy. The reality was not. Her breath fogged the air as she leaned toward the window. Beyond the glass, the world looked erased. She reached for her phone again. One bar, then none. The little no service message appeared, crisp as an insult. Megan's throat tightened. She thought of her mother back in town, always telling her to keep a blanket in the truck, to never let pride replace common sense. She thought of the last winter storm she'd worked, the one where a driver slid off an embankment and nobody heard the crash until daylight. She'd been the one to walk the edge and see the broken guardrail. She still remembered the smell of spilled antifreeze, sweet and wrong, mixing with pine sap in the cold. No, not today. She pulled on her heavier coat, the fabric stiff with weatherproofing, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her face like a slap. It bit her cheeks and seeped instantly into the space between her scarf and skin. The wind roared, a living thing, and the snow hissed over the hood of the truck. The world smelled clean and sharp, like iron and ice. Megan shut the door carefully, as if that mattered. She walked a few steps, turning slowly, trying to orient herself. Her boots crunched on packed snow, then sank into powder. She couldn't tell which way the road curved now. She couldn't even see the nearest tree clearly. The instinct to panic rose in her chest, hot and fast. She pressed a gloved hand against the truck's side, grounding herself in the cold metal, feeling the faint vibration of the engine still running. "All right," she said out loud, because the sound of her own voice made her feel less alone. "We find higher ground. We get one bar. We make a call." She started walking, keeping one hand on the truck as long as she could, then letting go and stepping into the white. The wind swallowed her immediately. Every direction looked the same. She moved toward what she thought was a slight rise, leaning forward into the gusts, her heart thudding in her ears. And then she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind changing pitch, a thin, wavering note. But it came again, weaker, like a question asked by something too small to understand it might not be answered. Megan froze. There it was, threaded through the roar, a high, trembling sound, soft, desperate, unmistakably alive. She turned her head slowly, listening the way you listen in a dark house when you're not sure you want to know what's there. The sound came again, and this time it wasn't just one cry. It was a faint chorus, as if the storm itself had trapped something fragile inside it. Megan's stomach dropped. Whatever it wasn't a human voice, but it was need. Pure need. The kind that didn't care about job titles, insurance forms, or whether the road was safe. She took one step, then another, following the sound into the whiteout, into a world that had already tried to erase her, and now was asking her to choose what kind of person she would be. The cries pulled Megan the way a thread pulls through cloth, thin, stubborn, impossible to ignore. She stepped carefully, boots disappearing into powder up to her calves. The wind shoved at her shoulders and rattled her hood. Snow crept into the tiny gap near her collar and melted against her skin, cold as a coin. The sound came again, sharper now that she'd turned the right way. It wasn't one voice. It was several, overlapping, each one small and frantic, like a handful of squeaky hinges trying to beg the mountain for mercy. A dark shape loomed out of the white. A fallen pine, its trunk snapped and half buried, needles crusted with ice. The air smelled like resin and broken wood, fresh sap in a world that otherwise smelled only of snow. Megan dropped to one knee, the cold soaking through her pants in seconds. She leaned toward a hollow where the branches met the drift, and there they were. 4 bobcat kittens, not much bigger than her gloved hand, their ears too large for their heads, their fur clumped with frost. Their mouths opened and closed in soundless effort between thin, hungry cries. One blinked slowly, lashes rimed in white, as if even that motion cost too much. For a heartbeat, Megan just stared. Her mind tried to do what it always did: measure, assess, keep distance. Wildlife, risk, bite, disease, procedure. She could almost hear the calm voice of training. Don't handle wild animals without proper equipment. But then the smallest one shivered so hard its whole body trembled, and Megan felt something in her chest twist like a knot tightening. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I've got you." She slid her gloves off with clumsy fingers and immediately regretted it. The air sliced at her skin. Still, she needed touch, needed to be gentle. She scooped them one by one, and each kitten felt shockingly light, like holding warm leaves that were already turning cold. Their tiny hearts fluttered against her palms, fast and uneven. She opened her coat and pressed them against her base layer, right under her collarbone where her body heat was strongest. The shock of their cold made her gasp. Their fur was damp and smelled faintly of earth and something wild, like leaf litter under snow. They squirmed, searching. One pawed at her sweater with needle-sharp claws that barely pricked, more desperate than painful. Megan pulled the coat tighter, forming a pocket with her arms, hunching over them the way you might huddle over a candle flame in wind. 4 heartbeats, tucked under one coat. She forced herself to look around for the mother. The snow was a blizzard-blown mess, but there were signs if you knew how to look. Faint depressions, a line of disturbed powder. Megan found a set of tracks that looked older, partially filled in, leading toward a stand of trees. Then, 20 feet farther, the pattern changed. The prints scattered, shallow and jagged, as if something had stumbled. And there, almost hidden, were tiny dots of red, no bigger than pinheads, on the snow's hard crust. Megan's stomach turned. She followed the broken trail a few steps more and saw a thin glint near a stump, metal, half buried. A loop of wire, dull and cruel-looking, the kind of thing people pretended wasn't dangerous until it was. Illegal or not, it didn't matter right then. It meant the mother might have been caught, or chased, or worse. Megan swallowed hard, tasting fear and something bitter, like old coffee gone cold. She wanted to keep searching, to find the mother and bring her back, to make the story end the right way. But the wind howled down the slope, and the kittens pressed closer to her warmth, their cries turning weaker. She checked her phone again. Still no service, no roadside assistance call, no emergency repair request to her dispatcher. No way to trigger the kind of help that usually arrived when paperwork and home insurance claims made people pay attention. Out here, there was only what she could do with her own hands. "All right," she breathed, more to herself than to them. "We're not dying here." She stood, dizzy for a second, as the cold rushed into her knees. The kittens shifted inside her coat, their tiny bodies like 4 small stones warming slowly against her skin. Megan tightened her grip and turned into the white, scanning for anything, any darker smudge that might be shelter. Somewhere ahead, the storm thinned for a blink, and she thought she saw it, a shape that didn't move like snow. A line, a roof line maybe, or the trick of desperate eyes. Megan leaned forward and started walking, carrying 4 lives against her heart. The dark shape held steady as Megan trudged toward it, and that alone felt like mercy. In the whiteout, everything else shifted and vanished, but this stayed put, a stubborn bruise against the storm. As she got closer, the outline sharpened into a cabin. Weathered boards, a low roof burdened with wind-packed snow. One small window filmed over with frost, the glass the color of old milk. The place looked like it had been here longer than she'd been alive, holding its breath through 100 winters. Megan's legs burned with cold and effort. The kittens inside her coat had gone quieter, their bodies pressed tight to her warmth, and that frightened her more than the wind. She could feel them with every step, 4 little tremors that were starting to fade. She raised her fist and knocked. The sound was small, almost silly, against all that wind. She knocked again, harder. The wood felt like it belonged to the mountain, dense and unwelcoming. For a moment, there was nothing but the hiss of snow. Then, from inside, a scrape, a pause. A click that could have been a latch or the slow decision of a person who didn't owe the world anything. The door opened a few inches. A man stood behind it holding an old-fashioned lantern, the flame wavering in a glass globe. The light made his face look carved, all sharp planes and tired eyes. He was in his 70s, broad-shouldered, under a heavy flannel, gray hair flat from a knit cap. His gaze flicked to Megan's hands, then to the white beyond her, as if measuring what kind of trouble she might be. "Who are you?" he called over the wind. His voice was steady, not loud, but it carried the way a command carries. "Megan," she said, her mouth felt stiff. "My truck got stuck. I lost the road. I just need to get out of the storm." The man didn't open the door any wider. He shifted so the gap stayed narrow, his body blocking warmth the way the mountain blocked the sky. "You don't come up here in a storm," he said, "not unless you've got nowhere else." "I don't," Megan answered, and her voice cracked on the truth. His eyes narrowed. She saw the calculation there, the caution of someone who'd learned that compassion can be expensive. Out here, people talked about supplies the way city folks talked about bills. A gallon of propane, a cord of wood, a generator that didn't fail when the temperature dropped. The kind of thing you don't appreciate until you've sat in a house that goes dark, praying your pipes don't freeze and your home insurance doesn't. Become the only thing standing between you and ruin. The man's gaze dropped. "What's under your coat?" Megan swallowed, then pulled the zipper down an inch and opened the front just enough. 4 tiny faces stared out, blinking slowly in the lantern light. Their fur was matted and salt white with frost. One mouth opened in a weak cry that sounded like a dry leaf being torn. The man's expression changed so fast it was almost painful to watch. His jaw tightened, his eyes softened and hardened at the same time, as if an old memory had slammed into him. "My God," he breathed, and for a second the lantern flame caught in his eyes. Megan leaned forward, pleading without meaning to. "They'll freeze. I think their mother's hurt. I saw... wire. I can't find her." The man stared at the kittens, then passed Megan into the storm, as if expecting another shape to appear. When nothing did, he exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath. "Listen to me," he said low. "If you ever hear 3 knocks out here, you don't open. You understand? People use storms for cover." Megan nodded, though she barely understood anything except that her knees were shaking and the kittens were going still. The man made a decision that looked like it cost him. "Come in," he said, and pulled the door wide. Warmth rolled over Megan's face in a wave that made her dizzy. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee grounds and something faintly sweet, like old pine pitch on a hot stove. The air inside was dim and amber, the kind of light that makes you feel you've stepped out of danger and into a memory. The man shut the door behind her and slid the bolt with a solid thunk. "What's your last name?" he asked as he moved, already reaching for a blanket with the speed of habit. Hart. He nodded once. Walter Grady. Then, softer, almost to himself. All right, Megan Hart, let's get those babies to the fire, now. Walter moved like a man who'd practiced staying calm when other people panicked. He set the lantern on a shelf, and its flame made the cabin walls glow honey brown, every knot in the old pine boards standing out like fingerprints. The wood stove in the corner ticked and pinged with heat, and the air carried that deep, comforting smell of smoke and hot iron, an honest warmth that didn't come from any smart thermostat or fancy HVAC repair visit, just fire and patience. Sit, he told Megan, not unkindly, pointing to a chair near the stove. Coat open, let the heat do its work. Megan eased down, joints stiff, the cold clinging to her like wet fabric. When she unzipped her coat, a pocket of trapped warmth escaped, and the 4 kittens shifted against her chest, little bodies trembling. Walter spread a faded wool blanket on the table, the kind with old red stripes, then grabbed a clean dish towel and held it near the stove until it felt warm. You got a name for them? He asked, already reaching in, carefully, as if he'd done this before. Megan shook her head. Her voice came out thin. I just heard them. That's enough, Walter said. Hearing is how it starts. He helped her lift them out one by one. Under the lantern light, their fur looked mottled, soft tawny brown with darker specks, like dry grass under snow. Their ears were too big, their paws too delicate. When Walter set the first kitten on the blanket, it let out a weak, raspy cry and tried to crawl toward the stove, drawn by the heat, the way a tired person is drawn to a bed. Megan watched his hands. They were big hands, veined and steady, the hands of someone who'd chopped wood and tightened bolts and probably fixed his own generator when the power lines went down. The kind of hands that didn't flinch. Walter rubbed each kitten gently with the warmed towel, not fast, not rough, just enough to dry the damp fur and wake the circulation. Warm first, he murmured, almost like a prayer. Food later. Megan's mind kept flickering to her truck out there, buried and alone. She could picture the dashboard, the phone's dead, no service, the tidy words she'd have to write when she got home. Incident log, equipment assessment, the kind of paperwork that turns into an insurance claim if somebody wants to argue over what a winter storm did. Normally, her job was to document damage, so an emergency electrician crew could be approved to roll before more homes went dark. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, it was just breath. Tiny breath. One kitten wriggled, another mewed, the sound soft as a squeak from an old door hinge. Megan felt her chest loosen for the first time since the whiteout swallowed the road. Then she noticed the smallest one. It lay on its side, too still, its body not pressing back against the towel the way the others did. Its whiskers were iced. Its little mouth hung open a fraction, and there was no sound. Megan's heart dropped so fast it made her dizzy. She leaned in, holding her own breath, willing herself to see movement. Nothing. No twitch. No shiver. Just a fragile weight that felt wrong in the warm room. Walter, she whispered, her throat tightened, the words scraping out. That one, it's not... Walter was already there. He didn't curse. He didn't gasp. He simply picked the kitten up and held it near his cheek as if listening for life the way a man listens for a distant engine. His eyes narrowed. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the kitten's chest, then shifted it closer to the stove without putting it down. Megan's hands shook in her lap. The cabin suddenly felt too quiet. Even the stove's crackle sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else's world. Walter looked at her once, and in that glance, Megan saw something old and heavy, someone who had watched the line between life and loss before. Not done yet, he said, firm. We try. He wrapped the kitten in the warm towel and cupped it in both hands, breathing slowly, feeding it heat. The seconds stretched thin and sharp. Megan could hear the lantern's faint hiss, the wind worrying the walls, her own pulse thudding in her ears. Walter's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the hallway. "Rooka," he called, voice low but certain. A pause, then the soft click of nails on wood, slow and careful, like an old dog rising from sleep. Rook appeared in the doorway like a shadow that had learned how to be gentle. He was a big dog, shepherd mix by the look of him, but age had softened him, gray dusting his muzzle, a stiffness in his hips that made his steps measured. His eyes, though, were clear and dark, the kind of eyes that had watched people in trouble and understood without being told. He paused, sniffing the air. Wood smoke, wet wool, fear, and something wild. Walter knelt beside the stove and opened the towel just enough for Rook to see the kitten. "Easy," he murmured. "Just warmth, that's all." Megan didn't realize she was gripping the edge of the table until her fingers ached. The smallest kitten lay in Walter's hands like a fallen leaf. The others, still on the blanket, made faint, hungry noises, thin squeaks that rose and fell with the stove's crackle. Their tiny paws flexed against the wool, searching for comfort in a world that had offered them none. Rook stepped closer. The sound of his nails on the plank floor was slow and steady. 1, 2, 3, as if the cabin itself was counting down. He sniffed the kitten once, then twice, and without a command, he lowered himself onto the floor beside Walter. He curled his body in a half moon, radiating heat you could almost see in the amber light. "Let him," Walter said quietly, answering Megan's panic before she could speak. "He knows what to do." Walter slid the kitten onto a folded towel near Rook's chest. Rook shifted with surprising care, drawing the little body in, tucking it against his warm fur. He laid one heavy front paw across the kitten's back, not pressing, just anchoring, like a hand on a shoulder that says, "Stay with me." The room went still. Megan heard everything at once, the stove ticking, the lantern's faint hiss, the wind scratching at the eaves like nails. She could smell the sharp edge of smoke and the clean cold clinging to her clothes. Her mouth tasted like metal and her eyes burned from not blinking. Seconds passed that felt like minutes. "Come on," Megan whispered, though she didn't know if she was speaking to the kitten or to God or to her own terrified heart. "Please." Walter didn't move. He simply watched, his face set in that calm, stubborn way people get when they refuse to let something end. Rook's breathing was slow and deep. In the lantern light, his fur looked almost coppery, warm against the cabin's honey-colored walls. The kitten, though, stayed limp. Then, so small Megan almost missed it, there was a twitch. A tiny shudder ran through the kitten's ribs like a spark catching in damp kindling. Megan's breath hitched. Walter leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Another movement, a faint opening of the mouth, and then a sound. Not a full cry, not yet. Just a thin, broken little exhale, like the softest whistle through a crack. Megan's knees went weak even though she was sitting. Tears blurred the room into a wash of gold and shadow. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold her heart in place. "That's it," Walter said, voice rougher now. "That's it, sweetheart. Stay." The kitten drew in a breath, one true breath, then another. Its paws flexed weakly against Rook's fur. Rook kept his paw there, steady as a promise. Megan let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Relief hit her in waves, warm and dizzying, the way relief does when it's been delayed just long enough to feel like a miracle. Walter stood and went to a shelf, pulling down a small box with medical tape and scissors. "We'll keep them warm," he said. "Then we'll talk about food. No hero moves." As he spoke, Megan noticed something she hadn't before, a faint metallic smell, like pennies clinging to the fur of one kitten. Walter sniffed too, and his eyes sharpened. He went to the window and scraped a circle clear with his thumb. Outside, the storm had eased for a moment, and the lantern light caught a dull glint in the snow near a stump. Thin wire, half buried, the loop of it waiting. Walter's jaw tightened. "Trap line," he said, not loud, but with a weight that made Megan's stomach sink again. "Somebody's been setting wire up here." Megan's earlier discovery flashed in her mind. The broken tracks, the tiny dots of red. The mother bobcat wasn't just gone. She'd been chased by something cruel and quiet. Walter turned back, and for the first time his calm looked edged with anger. "We'll get them through the night," he said. "And in the morning, we figure out what happened out there. We do it the right way." Megan looked down at the 4 kittens, alive, breathing, huddled together on the blanket like a bundle of fragile hope. And she realized the storm hadn't stopped asking things of her. It had only changed the question. Morning came the way it does after a hard storm, quiet, almost shy. The wind had spent itself in the night, and what was left was a brittle stillness that made every sound feel too loud. Megan woke in Walter's spare room with the faint ache of cold in her bones and the smell of wood smoke clinging to her hair. Somewhere in the cabin, the stove gave off a soft, steady tick as it cooled and warmed again, like a heart that refused to quit. She stepped into the main room and saw the kittens first. 4 small bundles on the blanket near the stove, their fur dry now, their bodies rising and falling in tiny, synchronized breaths. Rook lay beside them, chin on his paws, eyes half open, keeping watch the way old dogs do, quietly, faithfully, as if guarding hope itself. Walter was already dressed, boots on, coffee in hand. The mug was chipped, and the coffee smelled strong enough to wake the dead. He nodded toward the window. "Visibility's better. Not good. Better." Megan's throat tightened at the memory of the wire glinting in the snow. "We need to look," she said. Walter didn't argue. He just set the mug down and reached for a coil of rope and a pair of trekking poles that looked older than her truck. He moved with a deliberate efficiency, the same calm he'd shown in the night, but Megan could see something else in him now, an anger that sat low and contained. "You ever follow tracks in fresh snow?" he asked. "A little," Megan said. "Mostly I follow maps and damage reports." Walter gave a short, humorless smile. Tracks tell the truth when people don't. He left Rook inside with the kittens, made sure the stove was banked, and then handed Megan a strip of bright orange survey tape from a drawer. "Tie this to branches as we go. If the light drops again, we don't get turned around. You hear me?" She nodded. The tape felt slick and cold in her glove, neon against the cabin's brown wood. It reminded her of job sites, of safety protocols and liability, of the world where risk was managed on paper with signatures and insurance policies. Out here, risk was managed by not being foolish. They stepped outside. The air cut clean and sharp, and the snow underfoot had a crust that cracked with a dry snap. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, but the sun looked weak, like it was shining through thin cloth. The pines stood heavy with snow, their branches sagging, each needle tipped in white. Walter led, scanning the ground, then pointing with the tip of his pole. "There," he said. Megan saw it. Faint prints, half filled from the storm's last breath. Cat tracks, larger than the kittens, deliberate and wide. The mother's trail. They moved slowly, marking their path with orange tape. Megan could hear her own breathing inside her scarf and the distant drip of melting snow. Her hands were warm from motion, but her fingertips still tingled with cold. She hated how much she wanted the story to end with a living mother waiting somewhere, how her mind kept making a soft place for hope to land. The tracks didn't go toward safety. They went toward rougher ground where the trees thinned and the wind had scoured the slope. Walter crouched and brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. A shallow groove in the crust. A smear of dark hair caught on a twig. Megan swallowed. She was dragged? Walter's jaw worked once, or she dragged herself. They followed the trail to a stump, and there, half buried, was the wire loop again, thin, dull, and ugly. Walter didn't touch it. He just stared at it as if it offended him personally. "I did volunteer search and rescue," he said suddenly, eyes still on the ground. "A long time. You learn patterns. Panic makes people run straight. Injury makes them circle. Determination." He lifted his gaze to the slope ahead. "Determination makes them do impossible things." Megan glanced at him. "Why'd you stop?" Walter's mouth tightened. "Because sometimes you find the trail and you don't find the person." His voice stayed even, but the words landed heavy. "After that, you either keep going or you lock your door and tell yourself you're done." Megan felt the air shift between them, like a curtain pulled back. The cabin rule, the bolt, the suspicion. It hadn't been cruelty. It had been grief with a padlock. They crested a small rise, and the world opened into a rocky cut where the wind had stripped the snow thin. The tracks led straight toward a ravine, the kind that splits the mountain like a scar. The drop was hidden under drifted white, but the cold rising from it felt different. Damp, dark, hollow. Walter stopped a safe distance back and planted his pole. "Careful." Megan's stomach lurched as she approached. The tracks ended at the edge, a last set of prints pressed into the crust. On a rock nearby were deep claw marks, 4 bright scratches where something had fought for purchase. No blood pooled, no body, just the silence of a place that swallowed sound. Megan stared down into the white, her mind imagining too much. "She's gone," she whispered. Walter didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He looked at the ravine the way a man looks at a question he's asked himself for years. "Could be," he said softly, "or she got out and the storm covered it." Megan wanted to climb down anyway, wanted to turn this into a rescue she could finish the way she finished reports and closed cases. But her legs shook and she knew Walter was right. One slip, one hidden shelf of ice, and she'd become another set of tracks that ended in emptiness. They turned back, and that's when Walter froze. He crouched near one of their orange tape markers and pointed to the snow beside it. A print that wasn't theirs. A boot tread, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. Megan's skin went cold all over again. Someone else was here. Walter's eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line. "And they were close," he said. Back at the cabin, the kittens were still asleep, and Rook lifted his head, sensing the tension before either of them spoke. Walter slid the bolt into place with a hard, final sound. Megan looked at her phone. 1 bar flickered to life, then 2. Her heart thudded. She could finally make calls. Dispatch, wildlife rehab, maybe even the utility company's emergency line. The kind of calls that turned into invoices, service contracts, and the expensive but necessary machinery of help. But as she held the phone, a different thought settled in her chest. Whoever set those wires up here wasn't finished. And now, after seeing the boot print, Megan knew something worse. They weren't alone on that mountain. The first call Megan made wasn't to her supervisor. It was to the number Walter handed her from a yellowed card tacked above the kitchen table. Wildlife Rehab, 24-hour line, the kind of place people only learn exists after something breaks open in their day. Her phone felt strangely heavy now that it had signal again, like it carried the weight of every choice she'd made since the storm hit. The screen lit her face in a cold blue glow while the cabin around her stayed warm and amber. Outside, the mountain looked calm again, almost innocent, as if it hadn't tried to erase her hours earlier. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, alert, and tired, in the way night shift professionals get. Central Valley Wildlife. This is Dr. Park. Megan swallowed. My name is Megan Hart. I'm up in the Sawtooth backcountry. I found 4 Bobcat kittens in the storm. Their mother's missing. One was barely breathing. There was a pause, just long enough for Megan to hear the faint crackle of radio chatter on the other end. Then Dr. Park's voice sharpened into focus. Are the kittens warm? Are they dry? Any bleeding? Any obvious injuries? Megan looked down at the blanket by the stove. The kittens were awake now, wiggling clumsily, their little faces turning toward warmth. One opened its mouth and made a thin sound that reminded Megan of a squeaky toy left in the rain. Rook's eyes followed every movement, steady and protective. They're warm, Megan said. We dried them. We didn't feed them yet. Good, Dr. Park replied. No cow's milk, no human formula. Keep them warm, minimal handling, and don't let them imprint on you. Her words were gentle, but there was steel underneath. I can get to you, but I need coordinates. And I need you to understand something right now. Saving them does not mean keeping them. Megan's chest tightened. The phrase landed like a slap, even though she knew it wasn't meant that way. Somewhere inside her, a selfish part had already pictured a different ending. 4 small lives curled safely in a warm house, a story she could control. Walter watched her from the counter, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. The steam rose and vanished. Dr. Park continued. When wild kittens bond too strongly with humans, they lose the fear that keeps them alive. People mean well and still ruin them. Do you understand? Megan stared at the kittens, their fur now a soft mix of tawny brown and dark speckles, like autumn leaves pressed into velvet. The smallest, Frost, blinked up at her, and for a moment Megan felt that old, dangerous warmth. The urge to promise, I won't let anything happen to you again. Her throat burned. I understand, she said, though it hurt. Walter nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for her to say it out loud. While Megan relayed coordinates, Walter moved around the cabin, packing with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd lived through enough winters to know how fast trouble returns. He filled a thermos, set out clean towels, and pulled a collapsible kennel from a closet that smelled faintly of cedar and old canvas. Rook watched him, tail thumping once against the floor. An hour later, the sound of an engine came up the ridge, a low rumble that vibrated through the boards. Megan stepped to the window and saw a white SUV easing through the snow, headlights dull in the daylight. The vehicle had the kind of careful, expensive tires meant for bad roads, another reminder that help always comes with costs and planning. Somewhere in town, there were budgets, invoices, maybe even a liability waiver. Out here, there was simply the relief of not being alone. Dr. Elena Park stepped out wearing insulated coveralls and a knit cap pulled low. She was in her 40s, purposeful, the kind of woman who looked like she could carry a sedated deer if she had to. A second adult staffer stayed by the vehicle, checking equipment and scanning the tree line with the wary posture of someone who'd been charged by wildlife before. Inside, Dr. Park knelt by the blanket, her movements precise. She didn't coo. She didn't reach for comfort the way Megan had. She reached for survival. She listened to each kitten's breathing, checked gums, checked paws. When she lifted Frost, her eyes narrowed at a faint abrasion around the ankle, thin, almost healed, like a cruel bracelet had touched skin and let go. Dr. Park looked up at Megan. Where did you find them? Megan described the fallen pine, the broken trail, the wire loop, the pinpricks of blood. Walter added the boot print near their survey tape marker. Dr. Park's face didn't change much, but her jaw tightened. "That's not a normal trap," she said quietly. "And if someone is running a line up there during a storm, they're either desperate or they don't care who gets hurt." Megan felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when you realize the danger isn't over just because you're indoors. "Can you do something?" she asked. Dr. Park's gaze held hers. "We can report it through the proper channels. I can document injuries and evidence. That matters." She spoke like someone who knew how slow justice could be and still refused to give up on it. "But your job right now is to let go of the idea that you can fix everything with your own hands." Walter set a radio on the table, an older handheld unit with scuffed edges. "She's a field inspector," he said, almost amused. "They think if they log it right, the world will behave." Megan shot him a look, and Walter's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen on him. Dr. Park packed the kittens into a warmed carrier, separating them with cloth dividers so they wouldn't smother each other in their weak clumsiness. Frost gave one thin cry. Megan's hands twitched forward, then stopped. She forced herself to step back. That was the hardest part, doing nothing while love begged her to do more. As Dr. Park stood to leave, she turned to Megan. "If you want to help, you can," she said. "But you help the right way. You give them distance. And you take care of yourself, too." Walter walked Dr. Park to the door, exchanging a few low words Megan couldn't catch. When he returned, he slid the radio toward Megan across the table. "Keep it," he said. "Next storm, you call before you disappear." Megan stared at the radio, the plastic cool under her fingertips. It wasn't just a device. It was an offer, connection, trust, a way out of the lonely habit of handling everything alone. Outside, the SUV door closed. The engine started. The sound faded down the ridge, taking the 4 kittens with it. The cabin felt too quiet without their small noises, like the warmth had left with them. Megan stood at the window, watching the tire tracks carve away into the snow, and she realized something that made her breath catch. Saving them wasn't the end of the story. It was only the first goodbye. Winter loosened its grip the way an old man loosens a fist, slowly, stubbornly, and only when it has to. By the time Megan drove back up toward Walter's cabin again, the snow along the road banks had gone from blinding white to a gritty, sun-dulled crust. The air still carried that clean, sharp bite, but there was a new smell underneath it. Damp earth waking up, pine needles thawing, the faint sweetness of sap rising like a promise. Megan had kept working, kept filing reports, kept answering calls about outages and emergency repairs and all the expensive, necessary things that keep people safe. Generator rentals, service contracts, insurance documentation. Life in town didn't pause just because 4 wild kittens had once slept against her heart. But she noticed she wasn't the same. Every time she stepped into the cold, she remembered the weight of those 4 bodies under her coat, and she remembered the way Walter's door had opened when it didn't have to. She saw Walter twice over the following weeks, once to return his spare gloves and the thermos she'd borrowed, once because she couldn't stop thinking about the boot print and the wire. Walter didn't talk much about it, but he listened, and he made calls of his own, quiet calls, the kind that go to wardens and county offices and people who know the back roads. He never pretended the mountain would become safe overnight. He just refused to look away. Then, one afternoon in late spring, Megan's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Elena Park. "Ready for release. If you want to be there, meet us at the Ridge Access at 6:30 a.m. Bring quiet clothes, no perfume, no talking, near the carrier." Megan stared at the screen until her eyes blurred. Her first feeling was joy. The second was grief, because release meant goodbye that couldn't be softened with another blanket or another night by. The stove. The morning of the release, the sky was the color of pale porcelain, and the light had that gentle gold that makes older folks say it feels like the Lord is close. Megan met Dr. Park's truck at the access road. Walter arrived in his own vehicle, slower than he used to be, but still steady. Rook climbed out carefully and shook himself, sending a spray of dew from his fur. Dr. Park greeted them with a nod and led them down a narrow path through the pines. The forest was quiet in that spring way, birdsong high and clear, snowmelt trickling somewhere unseen, wind moving softly through needles like a long, slow exhale. At the clearing, Dr. Park set the carrier down and looked at Megan. "This is the part people ruin," she said, not cruel, just honest. "They want a moment, a hug, a picture. The animals don't need that. They need you to disappear." Megan's throat tightened. "I won't," she whispered. Walter touched her elbow, one brief, grounding contact. "You already did the hard part," he said. "You saved them without owning them." Dr. Park opened the carrier door. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a blur of tawny fur and dark speckles shot out like 4 arrows, loosed at once. The kittens weren't kittens anymore. They were lean, young bobcats, built for silence and sudden speed. They hit the forest floor, paused, and then flowed into the pines as if they'd been poured into their rightful place. Megan watched, barely breathing. The air smelled like cold dirt and sunlit bark. Her hands were numb, even inside her gloves. 3 of them vanished immediately, swallowed by shadow and brush. The 4th, Frost, stopped. It stood at the edge of the trees, half in light, half in shade. Its ears twitched. Its golden eyes fixed on Megan for one long second that felt like a lifetime. Megan felt her heart lurch, felt the old urge to call out, to say something foolish like, "I love you," as if love could travel across species and rules and wilderness. She did nothing. Frost blinked once, slow and calm, then turned and disappeared into the green. Rook let out a soft, single huff. Not a bark, not a chase, just a sound, like a farewell he understood. Walter's eyes glistened, and he pretended they didn't. Dr. Park closed the carrier and exhaled. "That," she said quietly, "is a successful ending." It should have been enough. It almost was. Months later, in early fall, Megan received another message from Dr. Park, this time with a video file attached, camera trap footage. "Thought you'd want to see it." Megan played it at her kitchen table, her coffee cooling beside her. The screen showed a moonlit stretch of forest, silver and grainy. Then movement, 1 bobcat, then 2, then all 4, healthy and alert, crossing the frame with the effortless confidence of animals that belonged. Frost was there, recognizable by a small scar near the ankle. Megan pressed a hand to her mouth, a laugh and a sob, tangled, together. At the edge of the frame, for a brief moment, a larger shadow moved, broad-shouldered, cautious. It didn't step fully into view. It simply passed like a memory refusing to be caught. Megan's skin prickled. Walter watched the video too when she drove up to show him. He sat very still, the cabin light warming the lines of his face. When the shadow moved across the screen, Walter's jaw worked once. "Could be the mother," Megan whispered. Walter didn't claim certainty. He just nodded slowly. "Could be," he said, "and sometimes that's all you get, proof that life kept going." They sat in the quiet for a while, listening to the stove tick and the wind move through the trees outside. Megan realized Walter's cabin didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a home with an open chair. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded flyer from the county office. Volunteer search and rescue. Training refresh. The paper smelled like fresh ink. "They're looking for experienced hands," Megan said gently. "You used to be those hands." Walter stared at the flyer as if it might bite him. Rook laid his head on Walter's boot, warm and insistent. The lantern flame wavered, and for a second Megan saw Walter, the way he must have been years ago, stronger, younger, still willing to step into storms. Walter's voice came out rough. "I don't know if I've got it in me." Megan looked at him, feeling the truth settle in her chest like a stone that was finally at rest. "You did," she said. "In the worst weather of my life, you opened the door." Walter's eyes lifted to hers. The silence stretched, not empty, but full. Finally, he reached out and took the flyer. "All right," he said, so quietly it was almost a sigh. "One meeting." Megan smiled, tears burning again. Outside, the forest stood dark and steady. Somewhere beyond the trees, 4 bobcats moved through their world, alive because a woman had huddled with them in a snowstorm, and because an elderly man's rescue had changed everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.